And whether President Trump will try to block the upcoming Senate testimony by his former FBI director, James Comey. He's scheduled to answer questions in public before the Senate Intelligence Committee on Thursday. When asked if the president will claim executive privilege to prevent Comey from telling his story, top aides to the president, including Sean Spicer, the press secretary, say a decision has not been made yet. Let's bring in our political and legal specialists. And Laura Jarrett, we're looking ahead to the former FBI Director Comey's testimony. But as you just heard, the White House considering invoking what's called executive privilege to block him from testifying. Is that even possible, and how would it work?
Well, if there's two big problems with trying to invoke executive privilege here. Number one is James Comey is a private citizen. He does not work for the president anymore. And so the president would essentially have to send in a lawyer to court to get this done, to order Comey officially not to testify. A pretty big and unprecedented move. And courts have routinely found that if there's any sort of criminal or governmental misconduct, then the privilege doesn't apply. The second issue here is that there are real questions about whether the president even waived executive privilege by repeatedly talking about his conversations with Comey, effectively opening the door to an entire line of inquiry here.
You know, Mark Preston, from a political perspective, what outcome would be worse for the president? Director Comey delivering some damaging testimony before Congress, or perpetuating the appearance of a cover-up by simply trying to block his testimony?
Well, no doubt, if we see James Comey go to Capitol Hill next week and is very clear, is very concise, and comes out and says that the president tried to get him to end the investigation, you know, that could be fatal, maybe not legally, politically perhaps, you know, because it could cause a lot of Republicans who have been rallying around him to then back off slowly as they look at 2018. But Wolf, if he does try to invoke executive privilege, all it's going to do is create more interest in the story, and that in itself could be very bad for President Trump.
There's a huge interest already for that testimony on Thursday. It's going to be, as we've been saying a lot, must-watch TV Thursday morning. David Axelrod, what do you believe? Would it be a mistake for the president to even try to block Director Comey from testifying?
Huge. You know, you presented two options to Mark. The third is the worst, which is you try and block him. The courts say you can't block him. And then you get the worst of both worlds. Look, this story is a blazing inferno because the White House and the president have laid log after log after log on the fire. This would be another huge log that would create suspicion. I had Senator Tom Cotton, a Republican who's on that Senate Intelligence Committee at the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago today, and I asked him whether he thought the president should invoke executive privilege, and he said no. He said if you don't have anything to hide, the best thing for you is to get all the facts out as quickly as possible. And we'll see if the president follows that. One last note on that. It was clear from Senator Cotton and others who I've spoken to that the Republicans are very much preparing for Comey's visit, and they're not going to greet him with rose petals. They're going to come with very tough questions about why he didn't go to the proper authorities when the president did what he alleges the president did. So I expect that he will have a tough time with some of the members of that committee, and that the White House might want.
Yeah, but you've heard, David, some of the explanations through his associates, his pals, his friends have been throwing out there. Each individual encounter with the president, he didn't seem was enough to justify that kind of action. But when you put them all together, looking back, maybe it was. You've heard that that could be his explanation.
Absolutely, and I expect it will be. And of course, there's the final chapter on that story, and that is that the president fired him. But I think the Republicans are going to do what they can to try and impeach Comey in this hearing. I'm not suggesting they will, but you know, we know a lot of what he's going to say. It'll be more interesting and engrossing to hear him say it himself. But those, what we've heard from those memos suggest what he will say in that hearing. It'll be interesting to hear his rebuttal to some of the attacks.
And you meant they're going to try to impeach his character, right?
Yes. Yeah. I know we shouldn't throw the I word around randomly here.
Right.
Yes, I'm talking about impeach his character. Yes. He's a private citizen now.
Of course. All right, so Laura, what do you think? How do you think he's going to handle that question when he's up there? He's got to explain why, assuming he didn't, why he didn't formally register a protest with the Inspector General, let's say, of the Justice Department, or go to Congress and say, the president is doing something totally inappropriate. He's pressuring me to stop an investigation.
Well, it's hard to know, but our colleague Gloria Borger came out with some reporting today from a source familiar with Comey's thinking on this. And what it seems to be is that he really thought that he could school the president on where the line should be drawn here. And while he was certainly uncomfortable with some of the requests, individually, he didn't see it as obstruction of justice or anything like that. And it's really more in the aggregate that it starts to look like a problem. But, you know, when it was happening, from what it sounds like from Gloria's reporting, is that Comey really thought that he could deal with it and that he could sort of train the president on how to approach this in a more responsible way.
You know, Laura, the White House also is continuing to dodge questions on the Russia probe altogether, including questions on meetings between Russian officials and Trump team associates. Listen to this from the White House briefing today.
Can you clarify the nature of the conversations that Jared Kushner had with Russian officials and a banker in December? And what was the date of the meeting with the banker?
I cannot, and as I've mentioned the other day, that we're focused on the president's agenda, and going forward, all questions on these matters will be referred to outside counsel Mark Kasich.
But how can you not answer questions on it when the president himself tweets about it?
We're focused on his agenda, and going forward, all questions on this matter will be referred to outside counsel.
All right, so Laura, you heard him say all questions on this whole Russia probe will be referred to as private, outside legal counsel. From a legal perspective, what do you think of that strategy?
Well, putting the tweets aside for a moment, which I think is a really hard issue for any lawyer to deal with, I think everyone agrees that punting to outside counsel is a smart thing to do. It protects the president, especially because the special counsel, Bob Mueller's investigation, is just getting off the ground. We have no idea how far it's going to go and for how long it's going to go. And by saying we're going to refer everything to outside counsel, Mark Kasich, it protects the president, and it leaves Sean Spicer some wiggle room to say, talk to him, let's get this out of the White House.
All right, everybody stand by. There's more we need to assess, more we're going to be discussing.
And the human pincushion, Sean Spicer out there, to say, after getting 2 days of questions about this, that, gee, I hadn't gotten a chance to ask the president that question on the day that he absents the United States from the most significant climate change agreement in global history. I mean, it's crazy, but I think it's another one of these bad situations where they think it's better to look ridiculous and make Spicer look ridiculous than answer the question.
Well, it's not just Spicer, Mark Preston. Several of the top administration officials have been on television over the past 24 hours. The aftermath of the president announcing the U.S. was pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, and they've all refused to answer what is a really simple question. Does he believe it's a hoax?
Well, Wolf, because they don't want to, as David was saying, was to contradict what the president might say in 5 seconds, 5 minutes, 5 days from now. And we've seen that time and time again. The bottom line for Donald Trump is that, and we've said this over and over, is that he puts his people, his top staff, in very difficult positions because he expects them to go out and defend the indefensible or not ask questions. We've seen that with Gary Cohn, with you. We've seen that with Sean Spicer day in and day out. And if you notice, Sean Spicer today was very careful how he was answering not only this question, but every other question. He kept looking down at the podium and reading basically pre-written statements out loud. And the reason why you do that is because you know that President Trump is right behind that door behind him, watching every word he says. So, again, I'm one of the few, Wolf, that is in the category of sympathy for Sean Spicer, because I do feel like he has arguably the toughest job in the world. But it's also Donald Trump who really should be the one that we're focusing on, because he's the one who is making all these decisions.
But David Axelrod, the press secretary to the president, has to have credibility with the news media as well, right?
Right. Right. First of all, I agree with Mark, and I have sympathy as well, but this is the job that Sean signed up for, and he didn't sign up for it unaware of the idiosyncrasies of Donald Trump. What Donald Trump doesn't understand is that he is burning all the people around him. None of them will have any credibility left, and that's a very bad place for the White House to be when none of the people, many of whom came in with credibility, exit with credibility.
But Wolf, let me just add to that, as David's saying, that is absolutely true, and the president himself is losing credibility, not only here at home and those on Capitol Hill, but world leaders with some of the conversations he's had with our allies. I mean, it really is perplexing about what kind of strategy he's following.
But at some point, David Axelrod, the president is going to have a news conference or do an interview with someone and is going to be asked the simple question, do you believe climate change is a hoax? What does he say then?
Well, it's a good question. God knows what he's going to say, which goes to Mark's point, because he could say something entirely different than others have said on his behalf, which is why they don't want to venture any opinion. What you've been hearing lately is, well, it doesn't really matter what I think. You know, what matters is the economy of the United States, the interest of the United States. It's just a semantic game. And, you know, most Republicans, even those who are climate change deniers, will say, well, yes, there's climate change, but there's been climate change for thousands of years. Now, Senator Cotton today said there's no doubt that that's accelerated dramatically in the last 200 years, and you have to assume that man has something to do with it. But, look, the president has never landed in a good place on this issue. He's clearly not comfortable with it. So I'm not, I've gone broke trying to predict what Donald Trump will say or do, and I can't do it now.
Let me go back to Laura Jarrett. Laura, you have some new reporting on an important ruling by the Department of Justice, which potentially could affect a lot of congressional investigations. Tell us more.
That's right, Wolf. This is an opinion issued from the Office of Legal Counsel, which essentially functions as the main law firm for the federal government and the president. And what this directive does is it says to federal agencies all across the Trump administration that they don't have to respond to inquiries from individual members of Congress. Oversight committees, subpoenas, that's a different ballgame. But when it comes to individual inquiries or requests, even from ranking minority members, they are under no legal obligation to respond to those. Now, of course, you can imagine Democrats on Capitol Hill did not take kindly to this at all. The top-ranking Democrat, Elijah Cummings, said to me in a statement, this is not what democracy looks like, and says, look, how are we supposed to do our oversight job? How are we supposed to report back to our constituents if we can't even get basic information? So really causing a lot of backlash here in D.C., Wolf.
Yeah. And that Department of Justice decision affects all of the executive branch. All right, everybody stand by. There's much more coming up, including Vladimir Putin now opening up about President Trump, Hillary Clinton, and more. Up next, Leader now has to say.
Well, Vladimir Putin tore into Hillary Clinton and her 2016 campaign with some very controversial remarks. He gave an impromptu analysis of President Trump's win in November, and he even referenced a 1980s pop hit in English. Wait till you hear that. This indeed was Vladimir Putin unplugged, but of course with a dose of calculation. It was trademark Vladimir Putin. Appearing on stage in a marathon interview forum today, the Russian leader surprised the audience in English.
Don't worry, be happy.
Invoking the 80s singer Bobby McFerrin, sarcastically describing the anger around President Trump's decision to pull out of the Paris climate change agreement. But in his native tongue, the former Soviet spy turned politician was far less sunny, continuing to deny Russian interference in the U.S. presidential election, while attacking former candidate Hillary Clinton, saying her campaign just can't admit its own mistakes caused her loss.
They decided to say, it's not our fault, it's the Russians' fault. It's like anti-Semitism, to blame the Jews for everything. We all know what this can lead to, nothing good.
At the same time, Putin spoke admiringly of Donald Trump's successful campaign.
The Trump team was more effective during the election campaign. He found an approach to the electorate that worked for him.
But he wasn't done there. On the heels of his comment on Thursday that Russian, quote, patriots, not the Russian government, might have hacked the U.S. election, Putin gave another denial, referring to U.S. intelligence reports on the hacking.
I read these reports. There is nothing specific in these reports, just assumptions and conclusions.
And he denied any discussions about sanctions between his government and the incoming Trump administration. Tonight, analysts say Putin is looking for deniability, trying to prevent investigators from tracing any alleged interference in the election directly to him. But at the same time, they say, it appears he's loving the attention and the strife inside the U.S. political system.
He now has a president who wants to have better relations with Russia. He has a scandal that has weakened the U.S. president, and he has a U.S. president who is busy lecturing his best allies about climate and about NATO. So there's lots of things that Putin is enjoying about the current crisis.
Vladimir Putin also came to the defense of the man who works for him here in Washington, Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak, who's at the center of investigations into Trump's aide's contacts with the Russians. Putin said, quote, "Our ambassador met with someone. What's the ambassador supposed to do? He must do that." He said reports of secret deals before the inauguration are plain hysteria, and, quote, "How should we stop that? Take a pill or something?" We also reached out to Hillary Clinton's representatives for response to his comments about her campaign. They declined to comment. Wolf?
All right, Brian Todd reporting. Thanks very much. There's breaking news ahead. President Trump weighing whether to invoke executive privilege to stop potentially very damaging testimony by the upcoming testimony by invoking executive privilege. The possibility of a dramatic showdown to silence the former FBI chief now under review at the White House. Refusing to answer. The president's chief spokesman still can't or won't say if Mr. Trump thinks climate change is a hoax. We'll look at new attempts to deflect questions on the Paris deal, pull out the Russia investigation, and more. Absolute confidence. We're told the president's son-in-law still has Mr. Trump's full support, even as Jared Kushner grows more embattled by the day with the constant drip of new revelations about his Russia contacts. And hysteria. Vladimir Putin dismisses the U.S. uproar over Russia, denying any secret deals were struck with the Trump team. In surprising new remarks, the Kremlin boss now is comparing claims of Moscow's election meddling to anti-Semitism. We want to welcome our viewers in the United States and around the world. I'm Wolf Blitzer. You're in the Situation Room.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Breaking news this hour, the Trump administration is refusing to rule out an attempt to muzzle James Comey. This as anticipation builds for sensational public testimony by the fired FBI director 6 days from now. White House officials say Mr. Trump will review a possible effort to invoke executive privilege. Tonight, a Senate Democratic source is driving home the difficulty of doing that, telling CNN the only way Mr. Trump might stop Comey would be to launch an unprecedented and politically risky court battle, and even that might not work. Also tonight, the White House is reaffirming that the president still has confidence in his son-in-law and senior advisor, Jared Kushner. But new questions keep arising about Kushner's Russia contacts and conflicting explanations about why he met with a banker linked to the Kremlin. President Vladimir Putin is weighing in on the Russia investigation tonight, dismissing it as hysteria. In new public remarks, Putin denies any secret backroom deals with the Trump team on lifting sanctions on Russia or anything else. Also breaking, the White House still won't say if Mr. Trump believes climate change is a hoax a day after his decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. Multiple officials were asked multiple times, but still no answer. I'll talk about all of that much more with Senator Ed Markey. He's a Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee. And our correspondents and specialists are also standing by. But first, let's go to our Justice correspondent, Jessica Schneider. Jessica, the White House now leaving the door open to invoking what's called executive privilege, but we're hearing more about what an uphill fight that could be.
That's right, Wolf. A Senate source says if President Trump wants to block Comey's testimony, he may have to take the fight all the way to federal court and seek a restraining order, something that has never been attempted before. Even if the president doesn't take it that far, the Senate source says Comey's private citizen status plus the president's statements make it all the more likely that Comey will, in fact, testify. Tonight, the White House is weighing whether to assert executive privilege to block FBI Director James Comey's testimony Thursday.
Literally, my understanding is the date for that hearing was just set. I have not spoken to counsel yet. I don't know what that how they're going to respond.
Counselor to the president, Kellyanne Conway, indicated she expects Comey to talk, but sent mixed messages when asked.
We'll be watching with the rest of the world when Director Comey testifies by hundreds of thousands.
So the president's not going to invoke executive privilege?
The president will make that decision.
Comey no longer works for the government, so the president can't order him to stay silent. And some say President Trump's tweets about Comey and declarations like these.
We had a very nice dinner, and at that time he told me, you are not under investigation, which I knew anyway.
Waive the president's right. Others argue asserting executive privilege is necessary.
It sets a dangerous precedent that the president's conversations, private conversations can be revealed. It will be a he said type of thing. It is one side of the story. I don't think that helps the process.
And there's new insight tonight into how James Comey might recount his conversations with the president. A source with knowledge of Comey's thinking says that while Comey was, quote, disturbed by his interactions with President Trump, Comey believed he had the situation under control. The source says if Comey believed at the time that any specific encounter constituted obstruction of justice, Comey would have done more than just write a memo. But tonight, the source says when Comey testifies next week, he may tell Congress that when all of the comments the president made to him are taken together, along with his firing, they could suggest a more serious pattern. And there are continuing questions about Jared Kushner's mid-December meeting with Russian bank chairman Sergei Gorkov, a man who has close ties to President Vladimir Putin. The White House insists Kushner conducted the meeting in his capacity during the transition. VEB Bank maintains it was part of its, quote, business roadshow. The meeting was arranged after Kushner met with Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak in early December at Trump Tower. In St. Petersburg Friday, President Putin defended the talks.
Our ambassador met someone. That's what the ambassador must do. That's his work. He's getting paid for that. He must meet. He must discuss current affairs. He must make agreements.
And Putin attacked Hillary Clinton for blaming her election loss on his country, using this over-the-top analogy.
They decided to say, it's not our fault, it's the Russians' fault. It's like anti-Semitism, to blame the Jews for everything. We all know what this can lead to, nothing good.
Kushner's meetings with Russian officials came as Russia was feeling pressure from the U.S. sanctions imposed after Russia's action in Ukraine. Retired coordinator of sanctions policy Dan Fried is now speaking out about his efforts earlier this year to stop the Trump administration from lifting sanctions against Russia, including those imposed by President Obama in December. Fried retired from the State Department in February and said he contacted lawmakers in an effort to codify the sanctions, something that never happened.
Lifting sanctions without the Russians doing anything as a free gift strikes me now as a bad idea. My colleagues were concerned about this, and so was I at the time.
Press Secretary Sean Spicer continued to refer all questions about the Russia investigation to the White House outside counsel. Spicer also said that Jared Kushner absolutely continues to have the full confidence of the president. Wolf?
All right, Jessica, thanks very much. Jessica Schneider reporting. The White House is clamming up tonight about more than just the Russia probe. Multiple officials refusing to answer a key question. Does the president still believe climate change is a hoax? Let's go to our senior White House correspondent, Jim Acosta. Jim, you and other reporters, you repeatedly pressed for information from the press secretary, Sean Spicer, from the EPA administrator, and you got more pushback. You didn't get answers.
That's right, Wolf. And keep in mind, President Trump, there was a media availability earlier this afternoon. He was asked once again whether he believes climate change is a hoax, whether he believes it's real. He did not answer the question. And so once again, he's left it to his top aides and administration officials. And today, it was the EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt's turn to explain what's going on inside the president's head when it comes to this question, and he was struggling to provide some climate cover. I tried at one point during the White House briefing earlier today to press Pruitt on the overwhelming scientific evidence that climate change is happening, and here's what's happened.
Why then is the Arctic ice shelf melting? Why are the sea levels rising? Why are the hottest temperatures in the last decade essentially the hottest temperatures that we've seen on record?
We've actually been in a hiatus since the late 1990s.
But sir, so there's, when NASA says that 95% of the experts in this area around the world believe that the Earth is warming, and you are up there throwing out information that says, well, maybe this is being exaggerated and so forth, and you're talking about climate exaggerators, it just seems to a lot of people around the world that you and the president are just denying the reality. And the reality of the situation is that climate change is happening, and it is a significant threat to the planet.
Let me say this, and I've said it in the confirmation process, and I said it yesterday. And
right, about the Arctic ice and the sea levels.
We have done a tremendous amount as a country to achieve reductions in CO2. And we have done that through technology and innovation. We will continue to do that. We will continue to stay engaged. We are a part, as you know, of the UNFCCC. And that process encourages voices by subnational groups and by countries across the globe. And we are going to stay engaged and try to work through agreements and achieve outcomes that put America's interest first. This is not a message to anyone in the world that America is should be apologetic of its CO2 position. We are actually making tremendous advances. We're just not going to agree to frameworks and agreements that put us at an economic disadvantage and hurt citizens across this country. Yes, sir.
Worried, though, that you're putting your head in the sand, though, Mr. Pruitt. They were a little worried that you're putting your head in the sand.
Well, there's no evidence of that.
Now, the other unsettling thing that happened later on in the briefing, Wolf, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer was asked about how he was asked earlier this week whether he had talked to the president about this belief that the president apparently has that climate change is a hoax. During that briefing earlier this week, Spicer told reporters that he would come back at some point and provide that answer in the briefing room. So he was pressed on that again today and asked, well, what is the answer? Does the president still believe climate change is a hoax? And Spicer did not have an answer to the question today, Wolf, despite having several days to work on just that one question. And of course, when the press secretary to the President of the United States is struggling to provide answers in the briefing room, then ultimately, undoubtedly, at some point, the questions are going to start to be about the future of the press secretary. And I think that's the problem that Sean Spicer has when he can't answer a basic question like that to reporters, Wolf.
Yeah, and they've been asked, as you point out, a few days ago about it. I'll get back to you. They had a few days and didn't get back to the reporters. Jim Acosta, thanks very much for that report. Let's get some more on all of this. Senator Ed Markey is joining us. He's a Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee. Senator, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
All right, we got a lot to discuss, but I want to begin with next week's scheduled testimony from the former FBI Director James Comey, scheduled to appear before the Senate Intelligence Committee Thursday morning for the first time since he was fired by President Trump. The White House now is considering invoking executive privilege to block his testimony. Are you worried that the president will prevent Comey from giving a full account of their exchanges?
Yeah, that would actually create a complete mess of this investigation of the potential Russian interference in the American elections. I think that the American people have a right to know whether or not in fact, President Trump asked Jim Comey to pledge his loyalty to Donald Trump, whether or not he asked Comey to let the Flynn investigation go, whether or not he told the president that on 3 separate occasions that the president was not under investigation, because we have to get the answers to those questions. And if the president attempts to invoke executive privilege, that would just continue to raise the question of obstruction of justice, which the very firing of Jim Comey has raised in the minds of the American people.
Senator, would the Senate respect the president's invocation of executive privilege, or will the Senate force the president to go to court, a federal court, and ask that court to block Director Comey from appearing?
Well, I would hope that Democrats and Republicans would put politics aside, put party aside, and put the best interest of our nation front and center, because ultimately the American people are entitled to these issues, and the Senate has prerogatives as well, which the president cannot truncate. So I would hope that Democrats and Republicans will stand strong and insist that Comey testify, and if the president attempts to invoke executive privilege, that the Senate use all of its prerogatives, including going to court, in order to ensure that Comey tells the Senate and through the Senate, the American people, what happened during that Russian investigation.
Well, Senator, I also want to get your thoughts on the White House punting all Russia-related questions to outside private legal counsel. Listen to Sean Spicer at the White House briefing today.
Can you clarify the nature of the conversations that Jared Kushner had with Russian officials and a banker in December? And what was the date of the meeting with the banker?
I cannot, and as I've mentioned the other day, that we're focused on the president's agenda, and going forward, all questions on these matters will be referred to outside counsel, Mark Hassel.
But how can you not answer questions on it when the president himself tweets about it?
We're focused on his agenda, and going forward, all questions on this matter will be referred to outside counsel.
So what do you think of the White House strategy here, Senator Markey, especially in light of the fact that the president himself continues to frequently tweet, I should say, about the Russia probe, calling it a witch hunt?
Well, they want to go dark. They don't want to have to respond. They want private counsel to respond and then private counsel to say we can't comment. And as a result, the American public won't be able to ask or get the answers to these questions. So again, it's just a further attempt to obfuscate, a further attempt to cover up the information which the American people have a right to know the answer to, including what was the subject material that Jared Kushner actually talked about with the Russian banker. What was the subject material that Jared Kushner talked to Ambassador Kislyak about? The American people right now have a question about the compromise of their election last year, the presidential election, and during the transition period, what was the Trump administration doing? This is just another attempt to kind of sweep it under the rug, hope that time passes, hope that people lose their focus, that the press goes away, that other issues will arise. But it's not going to happen, Mr. President. The pressure is going to continue to mount until you give the American people the answers to these key questions, and every day that you delay is a step closer to a constitutional crisis.
As you know, there's a lot of speculation that the subject of those conversations may have been U.S. sanctions against Russia and lifting those sanctions. The former coordinator for sanctions policy at the State Department says it would be a free gift if the Trump administration were to relieve Russia of those sanctions without receiving anything in return. Do you worry that the Trump administration is going to take that step?
I do worry. I think that, unfortunately, Donald Trump has given signals that he believes that cozy cooperation with Putin is the pathway to a better world. But in Crimea, in the Ukraine, in Syria, in the compromise of the American presidential election in 2016, how many instances do we need to understand that Putin does not care about the values of human rights and of the values which are central to what America stands for? So I am very concerned that if the signal was ever sent from the Trump transition team that sanctions could be relieved without any actions by Russia to improve their own behavior, that would only further embolden Putin to continue to engage in these reckless activities, which in fact are undermining national security for the United States and for the rest of the world.
Very quickly, Senator, what about that report in the Washington Post that the Trump administration is actually moving toward the possibility of returning 2 diplomatic compounds to the Russians, one on the eastern shore of Maryland outside of Washington, one out on Long Island outside of New York? Those compounds, as you know, were confiscated in December in retaliation for Russian election meddling. What message would that send? Because you know the Russians, they really want those 2 compounds back.
Again, it's a signal to the Russian government that they're going to get what they want without, in fact, giving the United States what it needs. And that is just not acceptable. It is, again, almost like his decision to back out of the Paris Climate Accord, a presidential indifference to the role that the United States must play on these critical global issues to provide leadership.
List now of Trump administration officials who can't seem to answer a simple question. Does the president still believe climate change is a hoax? You remember, he's tweeted back in 2012, he tweeted, the concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make U.S. manufacturing non-competitive. A year later, he tweeted, ice storms roll from Texas to Tennessee. I'm in Los Angeles, and it's freezing. Global warming is a total and very expensive hoax. So why can't these officials now answer the simple question, does the president still believe what he tweeted back then?
Because Donald Trump's climate science is as bogus as a degree from Trump University, which is where I think he's getting his climate science from. And he basically has decided he's going to honor his pledge to 70,000 coal miners in our country and break the United States made to the world and break the pledge which this generation of Americans should keep to every subsequent generation of Americans to avoid the most catastrophic consequences of climate change. And so he's just listening to Steve Bannon, to the climate deniers, and trying to make his base be happy, even if the National Academy of Sciences of every single country in the world has concluded that science of climate change is absolutely and totally non-debatable with regard to it accelerating and it being caused by human activity.
The president, he's receiving, as you know, a lot of fierce blowback from leaders around the world, including very close allies for this decision to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. I want you to listen to this. This is the new president of France, Emmanuel Macron.
Because wherever we live, whoever we are, we all share the same responsibility. Make our planet great again.
All right, so you just heard him co-opt the president's campaign slogan. So is the decision to pull out of the Paris Agreement a major blow to America standing out there on the world stage when you have these allies very, very critical of the U.S. decision?
Yes, it completely undermines our credibility as a global leader. It is an abdication of American economic opportunity, of our national security interests, of the public health implications of sending all of this additional pollution up into the air that leads to asthma, heart disease, and it's a moral failure. Pope Francis asked him to be the leader, to step up. And as the chairman of the Climate Change Committee in the House of Representatives for 4 years, I chaired 100 hearings on this subject. And across the world, from Ban Ki-moon to the Prime Minister of Sweden, who testified before the committee, there was unanimity of opinion that this was real, it would be catastrophic, but it would also offer tremendous economic opportunity to create millions of jobs in our country. And what the president has decided to do is to cede that leadership to China, to France, to Germany, who will be now much more likely to reap the economic benefits of a revolution which is just going to continue unabated with the United States on the sidelines.
Senator Markey, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Just ahead, we'll have more on the breaking news. Will the president invoke executive privilege to try to silence James Comey? And if he does, will that work? Our specialists are standing by. And why is the White House fueling a climate of uncertainty by refusing to